something is happening right now in our solar system that most people are not emotionally prepared to face. It's occurring in a region of space we cannot observe, not because we lack technology, but because the universe itself has drawn a curtain. Behind the blinding brightness of the sun, just beyond our line of sight, two luminous interstellar objects have slipped into a region of total invisibility. And while the world scrolls through memes, politics, and celebrity gossip, NASA has gone almost completely silent. Data streams have slowed. Observatories have reduced public output. Certain telemetry feeds that used to update hourly now lag for days. The official explanation is routine solar conjunction interference. But the timing is too sharp, too synchronized, too mathematically aligned to pass as coincidence. 3I, Atlas was the first anomaly, the strange visitor that made everyone whisper. But 3I, Atlas wasn't the headline, it was the signal. It was the message before the message. It was the key placed in the lock, not the door opening. Because what arrives second is what changes everything. The second object, Swan R2, did not simply drift into our system like a passive relic. It arrived like a flare. It arrived luminous, structured, intentional. When both objects dipped behind the solar corona, their trajectories formed a synchronized blind interval, a period in which no telescope on Earth and no probe in orbit could monitor their evolution. And that is the exact window in which the silence began. What are they doing back there? Is there a maneuver happening right now, behind the sun, that we aren't allowed to see? Why did both objects cross into invisibility at the same time, at the same position, during the same week? That is why this moment matters, because astronomers understand a truth that the general public hasn't grasped yet. Nature does not coordinate like this. Physics produces chaos with beauty. Intelligence produces symmetry with intention. 3I Atlas was the flicker, the calibration ping. Swan R2 is the arrival, the engine, the payload, the purpose. And if these two visitors are acting like phases of the same operation, then we might not be waiting for disclosure. Disclosure might already be unfolding behind the sundae. And the universe for the moment is silent. But silence is not always absence. Sometimes silence is the prelude. The first sign that something larger was unfolding didn't come from Swan R2. It began with 3I, Atlas, an object so faint, so deceptively ordinary at first glance, that most astronomers dismissed it as just another interstellar curiosity. But 3I, Atlas didn't behave like a rock. It didn't behave like ice. It behaved like something responding, adapting, adjusting. Its brightness fluctuated not in chaotic bursts like sublimating gases, but in smooth, controlled modulations, as if emissions were being regulated, not produced at random. And that's when the subtle tension began building inside NASA circles. This wasn't a comet. This wasn't debris. This was a system. It had pattern. It had intention hidden inside its numbers. The kind of intention that only becomes visible when you compare its behavior to everything we've cataloged in the last century. 3I, Atlas didn't accelerate the way physics teaches acceleration. It didn't shed material like a passive traveler being cooked by sunlight. Instead, its trajectory curved in ways that implied microcorrections, like thrust decisions, as if it was responding to environmental variables, not merely obeying them. But the real turning point wasn't its motion, it was the timing. 3I Atlas entered our solar system at the exact historical period when the world had finally developed the instruments to detect subtle solar wind anomalies in real time. If it had arrived in 1800 or 1950 or even 2005, we would have missed 90% of the signals. We would have called it a strange comet and moved on. But it came now, when we have the sensitivity to measure millisecond plasma fluctuations and microshifts in reflectivity. That timing alone suggests alignment with observation, not accident. And that is the first reason this story escalates from weird to unnerving. Because 3I Atlas acted as if it wanted to be seen just enough to raise suspicion without revealing its full nature. The way a scout behaves, the way a probe behaves, the way a messenger behaves, not the way a rock behaves. And when astronomers mapped 3I ATLAS's path through interstellar space, they found that it wasn't drifting on a random inbound line. It entered from a region of the sky where almost no long-period bodies originate. It came from a direction that statistically should produce almost nothing. Which raises a question no one wants to address publicly. How does a random natural object arrive on a statistically impossible trajectory, just months before a second interstellar object arrives from a completely different direction? Yet both will pass the Sun in the same temporal window? That is not chaos. That is not luck. That is sequencing. And sequences imply authorship. 3I. Atlas wasn't the main event. It was the first move. And the universe was waiting to see if we noticed. If 3I, Atlas, was the whisper, Swan R2 was the shout. The moment Swan R2 appeared in the data stream, everything about the narrative changed. This wasn't a subtle object. This wasn't small. This wasn't ambiguous. Swan R2 arrived like a flare that refused to be ignored. When the spectral readouts first hit the instruments, analysts assumed a software glitch because the reflectivity returned values that simply do not occur in nature. You can explain ice, you can explain dust, you can even explain crystalline structures under rare conditions, but you cannot explain a surface that behaves like a metallic alloy yet moves like a plasma shell. Swan R2 doesn't shimmer, it projects. It radiates. It announces itself. Every signature it emits feels less like natural light and more like engineered illumination, not passive reflection, active emission. It's as if the object isn't being lit by stars, but is generating luminosity from within. And that's why the scientific community split. Because if you admit Swan R2 emits energy in controlled spectral bands, you must simultaneously admit the possibility of system-level energy management, something that comets do not do, cannot do, and will never do. Swan R2 is structured the way a mechanism is structured: panels, plating, layered armor-like segmentation, not in the chaotic fragmentation patterns we see in frozen debris. Instead of shedding material into a messy tail, Swan R2 bends the solar wind, the way magnetic shielding bends ion streams. That means we aren't looking at erosion, we're looking at manipulation. We're looking at something that understands the environment it's entering and acts accordingly. But what makes Swan R2 truly chilling isn't its brightness, it's the timing. Swan R2 entered the system only after 3I, Atlas, had already provoked suspicion. And it didn't come along the same path because if it had, we could blame coincidence. No. Swan R2 plunged in from an entirely different sector of the sky, as if approaching from another vector in a coordinated maneuver, and then both objects aligned their perihelion windows within days of each other. That temporal overlap is the equivalent of two aircraft approaching the same runway from different continents and landing the same week without air traffic control. Nature doesn't behave like that. Scheduling does. Coordination does. Mission sequencing does. If 3I, Atlas, was the scout, Swan R2 behaves like the follow-up unit, the heavier asset, the carrier, the fortress. The object that arrives after reconnaissance is complete. And if that interpretation is even partially correct, then what we are witnessing is not random interstellar debris, but phases of a strategy unfolding on a scale that dwarfs human history. 3I, Atlas, was the opening move. Swan R2 is the escalation. And the pattern is only beginning. There is a moment in every investigation where speculation collapses under mathematics. And with Swan R2 and 3I, Atlas, that moment arrives when the numbers are compared side by side. Because numbers don't care about belief. Numbers don't care about narrative. Numbers don't care about comfort. Mathematics simply describes what is. And what is, in this case, is something so precise that randomness becomes the least logical explanation. The repeating constant of 22 is the first signal that coincidence is no longer a rational refuge. 22 pulses per electromagnetic emission cycle. 22,554 years for the orbital period. 22 gigahertz emissions at peak detection. These numbers aren't approximate, they're exact. They don't drift, they don't wobble, they don't smear over time the way natural systems do. Instead, they repeat as if they were designed. In nature, precision decays. In engineering, precision persists. So, when the same motif appears across multiple independent measurements, orbital period, frequency, timing, modulation, the question becomes unavoidable. Who or what is sustaining the precision? If the universe were rolling dice, the patterns should blur. But they don't, they sharpen. And here's the terrifying part. These constants only became visible because we now have the technology to detect them. If SWAN R2 had arrived during the 1970 seconds, the 1980 seconds, we would not have seen the encoding. Our radio telescopes were too slow, our data pipelines too coarse. These signatures needed modern signal processing to even be visible, which raises a haunting possibility. Is the timing chosen specifically for a civilization capable of reading the numbers? If so, that alone implies intention. But the 22 signature isn't the only numerical anomaly. When analysts mapped the inbound trajectories of both interstellar visitors, the odds of two unbound objects arriving in the same epoch from different sectors, crossing similar solar proximity windows, is so low that standard probability doesn't even express it coherently. Statisticians had to convert the scenario into logarithmic improbability to make the math readable. We're not talking 1 in a million, we're talking 1 in a universe. And when the improbable repeats, it ceases to be chance, it becomes choreography. This is when the scientific tone changes. This is when the cold, skeptical language of astrophysics begins to whisper something uncomfortable. This looks like communication. Because nothing in physics requires a comet to encode its own orbit inside its emission spectrum, nothing in thermodynamics suggests a natural object should broadcast its identity in binary. Yet that's what SWAN R2 appears to be doing, a cosmic self-portrait written in numbers, almost as if someone wanted whoever observed it to recognize structure, not mythologize randomness. Nature does not do that. Systems do. Technology does. Coded intelligences do. And if a code exists, then someone encoded it. Every recorded interstellar visitor in human history, from Oumuamua to Borisov, has obeyed a simple, unbreakable rule of celestial mechanics. Objects that originate from outside the solar system do not stay. They arrive, they swing around the sun, and then they exit forever on open hyperbolic trajectories. Gravity may bend their path, but it cannot hold them. That has been the iron law for centuries of observation. That is what textbooks teach. That is what orbital mechanics models assume. And that is why SWAN R2 fractures the paradigm, because SWAN R2 does not escape. SWAN R2 loops. SWAN R2 returns. It moves like something with a destination, not like something drifting through emptiness. When NASA ran orbital simulations, the calculations froze the room into silence. The projected orbit wasn't open. It was a closed ellipse bound to the Sunday. That alone defies the natural universe. But then came the truly alarming detail, the precision of the orbital period. 22,554 years, not approximate, but exact down to the decimal. Natural orbits don't behave like that. The gravitational tides of the galaxy distort trajectories over time. Planetary perturbations shift orbits by small but measurable margins. Chaos creeps in. Drift is inevitable. Yet SWAN R2's orbit is so clean, so constrained, so impossibly stable that you would think someone is updating its flight path in micro increments. And that's when astrophysicists began using a word they normally avoid: guidance. Because if the orbit doesn't degrade, something is correcting it. And if something is correcting it, then control systems exist. And if control systems exist, then this object is not merely an ancient rock, but something far more sophisticated. Imagine an object placed into orbit tens of thousands of years before the earliest civilizations built their first stone structures. Imagine a device, not a comet, that returns like a cosmic metronome, synced to a schedule that predates written language. The last time SWAN R2 would have been near Earth, humanity was barely out of the Ice Age. Firelight, stone tools, mammoth hunts. That's the historical context. And now it's back, just at the moment when our detection technologies finally matured. Was that timing a coincidence? Or was this orbit designed for recognition? When some astronomers attempted to model the orbital stability, they realized it would require periodic energy inputs, subtle thrust. Not a rocket plume, but micro-impulses, invisible unless you have sensitive spectral and gravimetric equipment. In human engineering terms, this is the equivalent of tiny course corrections, the kind spacecraft use to remain in stable trajectories. That is why Swan R2's orbit is the most incriminating evidence so far. You could call the reflectivity unusual. You could call the emissions unexplained. But a non-hyperbolic return orbit, precise and self-correcting, is the line that divides speculation from inevitability. At that point, the question is no longer, what is Swan R2 made of, but who set it moving? Nature does not sustain orbital perfection, but technology does. And perfection is exactly what Swan R2 displays. Right now, at this precise moment in history, humanity is blind, not metaphorically, but literally blind. The Sun is positioned between Earth and both interstellar objects, creating a natural observational blackout zone known as solar conjunction. When spacecraft slip behind the Sun during conjunction, even our most advanced communication links degrade or disconnect entirely. For probes, it's a technical inconvenience. For two interstellar anomalies silently operating beyond Earth's line of sight, it becomes a perfect veil. In every era of astronomy, conjunction has always been a simple observational limitation, a temporary curtain of plasma and radiation. But this time, conjunction coincides with the most mathematically improbable dual arrival event in the history of astrophysics. Both 3I, Atlas, and Swan R2 disappeared behind the Sun almost simultaneously. That timing, again, should not exist in an uncoordinated universe. And during this blind interval, the silence began. NASA telemetry updates slowed. Raw data streams that were previously available to researchers lagged. Public-facing observatories reduced spectral dumps. Certain live solar wind dashboards that normally refresh minute by minute now show sparse updates. No denial, no explanation, just friction, silent friction, the kind that happens when institutions know more than they can comfortably say. And while the world sees this as a period of low visibility, the truth is much simpler. This is the ideal moment for maneuvers. If you were going to change trajectory, adjust orientation, fire a propulsion pulse, this is when you would do it, when no telescope can track the shift. What chills many researchers is not just the disappearance, but the pulse detected 3 days before the blackout. A 22-second structured electromagnetic burst from the direction of the Sun with harmonic patterns matching Swan R2's 22-based binary signature. Not a solar flare, not plasma noise, not random interference. Something much more controlled, much more deliberate. A ping, a handshake, a beacon, and then both objects vanished behind the solar curtain. If this were a scene in a movie, audiences would immediately assume coordination. Yet because this is reality, most people instinctively retreat into denial. It's more comfortable to believe that none of this matters than to accept that something might be happening on a cosmic scale, outside our control. But physics doesn't require belief. Physics simply unfolds. And when the Sun blocks our view, time itself becomes a weapon. Every hour we cannot observe these objects is an hour when something could be changing, evolving, adjusting beyond our line of sight. The next time they emerge, they could be exactly where they were predicted, or they could be somewhere else entirely. For the first time in human history, the universe has moved behind a curtain and left us waiting in the dark. This is the part of the story that most scientists avoid, not because the data fails to support it, but because acknowledging the implications forces us to confront a possibility that reshapes our understanding of who we are in the cosmic hierarchy. If Swan R2 and 3I, Atlas are coordinated phases of the same operation, then that implies agency. Agency implies intention. Intention implies authorship. And authorship implies intelligence older, larger, more advanced, and possibly ancient beyond imagination. Suddenly, the question is no longer whether we discovered something unnatural. The question becomes whether something finally decided to reveal itself, because we are now capable of detecting it. The synchronization, the repeating numerical signatures, the orbital perfection, the structured pulses, if these factors arrived in separate contexts, they could be dismissed, but they converge. They reinforce, they overlap. The universe rarely hands us a direct narrative. Yet here, the narrative is not subtle. It is threaded into the data like a message waiting for someone ready to read it. And that leads to the possibility no one wants. What if we are not observing these objects? What if we are the ones being observed? Consider the timing. Humanity has spent only the last century broadcasting radio noise into the cosmos, only the last decade streaming high-resolution live sensor data into the public sphere. What if this is a reply? What if Swan R2 is not an intruder but a returning mechanism checking in on a young technological species the same way a researcher checks a control sample that would reframe our entire cosmological identity? Humanity becomes not an accidental observer but a monitored system, a laboratory that has finally reached a threshold worth re-evaluating. The most discomforting detail is this: the last time Swan R2 would have passed this way, humanity was emerging from the Ice Age. Agricultural systems were embryonic. Civilization was a whisper. And back then, myths exploded worldwide. Stories of skyfires, returning gods, watchers descending, teachers who came from the heavens. Archaeologists dismiss these as metaphor. But metaphor doesn't explain ritual precision. Myth doesn't explain megalithic alignments calibrated to celestial coordinates, invisible to naked eye observation. What if those myths were simply eyewitness reports recorded in symbolic language from the last time Swan R2 arrived? Because if Swan R2 is returning on schedule, then the schedule involves us. And here is the conclusion that chills the scientific mind more than alien contact. Perhaps this isn't first contact at all. Perhaps this is a continuation of an exchange older than human memory, and we are only now advanced enough to recognize the pattern. If so, then Swan R2 doesn't simply represent a question. It represents a test, a checkpoint, a moment in cosmic time when an observer returns to evaluate what humanity has become. And the next step, whatever it is, might already be unfolding behind the sundae. In every era of scientific discovery, there is a tipping point, a moment when the evidence stops whispering and starts speaking clearly enough that denial becomes more irrational than belief. We may be standing at that threshold right now. 3I Atlas was never the main story. It was simply the first ripple in a far deeper wave. It was the soft knock on the door. Swan R2 is the impact moment, the pivot point, where the narrative stops behaving like cosmic coincidence and begins to resemble mission architecture. Two interstellar bodies, arriving from unrelated directions within the same epoch, encoding numerical signatures that repeat across emissions, timings, orbital mechanics, and energy output, vanishing behind the sun in a synchronized blind interval. This pattern is not chaos, it is choreography. And choreography implies a choreographer. But the world isn't ready for that sentence yet. We've been trained for decades to believe that interstellar visitors are lifeless relics, frozen leftovers from creation, passive, inert, incidental. But what if the universe has been more intentional than we dared imagine? What if the cosmos is not a silent, cold ocean, but an ecosystem where ancient structures move along pre-written paths with purpose, logic, and intelligence? And if these objects have been here before, long before human history, then we aren't witnessing a surprise arrival. We are witnessing a scheduled return. That is the real shock. Because if the 22,554-year cycle is precise, then this visit was always coming. The timing wasn't random, it wasn't luck, it wasn't chance intersecting with human technology. It was an appointment, and humanity finally showed up with instruments sharp enough to notice. Which forces a question that reaches far beyond astronomy and into the foundations of human meaning itself. What happens after return? Are these objects here to observe or to interact, to update or to intervene? Are we the audience or the subject? Is this a continuation of a conversation that began before the pyramids, before writing, before civilization? Because if Swan R2 is not here for the first time, then it has seen us evolve from firelight into quantum computation. It knows we exist. It knows we're watching. And the universe right now is holding its breath behind the sundae. Soon the curtain will lift. Soon Swan R2 and 3I ATLAS will emerge back into view. And when they do, the question won't be whether they exist, but what they intend. Until then, all we can do is wait and listen, because the next signal may not be subtle, it may not be encoded, it may not be mathematical, it may be direct. And when that moment arrives, humanity will no longer be asking whether we are alone. We will be asking whether we were ever the ones in control.